Welcome to the TLC Talks podcast, produced by the Teaching and Learning Center at North Seattle College. I'm your host, Dan Tarker, Dean of the Library and Learning Support Services. And today we are here with Valerie Hamilton, our Director of Disability Services. And she's going to be talking to us about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And she's going to tell us why this is important, why this was an important act and section to the act, how it's impacted students with disabilities, and we're also going to talk about how we can do better supporting not only students with disabilities, but also our colleagues with disabilities as well. So a very informative conversation. Please sit back, pour yourself a cup of coffee, tea, beverage of your choice, and enjoy this informative conversation with Valerie Hamilton. We are here with Valerie Hamilton, the Director of Disability Services at North Seattle College. Welcome, Valerie. Welcome to the TLC Talks podcast.
Wow, I'm super excited to be here.
I'm excited.
The inaugural.
And this is different, right? Because we're actually in person talking together. Whenever we've done this in the past, it's always been over Zoom or some other medium like that. So it's kind of different looking somebody in the eyes.
It is, yeah. An actual conversation.
An actual conversation with a fully fleshed out human being sitting across the table from me.
That's awesome.
So we're here to talk about the Rehabilitation Act, or specifically Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And why are we celebrating that, Valerie? Why is that important? Why should the college community even be thinking about this topic?
Well, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was foundational in getting people with disabilities equal access. And it really was the foundation for everything that we do in the public and private sphere. It's really important to recognize that there were a lot of very brave and very tenacious individuals who really fought hard to make sure that everyone could be treated like human beings. Right. Because prior to this, they weren't able to make their own decisions. A lot of folks were living in homes that were just awful. Right. People who wanted to work couldn't because they couldn't have access, and you couldn't take public transportation, you couldn't get on a bus, you couldn't get on a subway in New York, you couldn't hold down any job because most jobs wouldn't have anything accessible for you. Right. And so people who got together, and particularly this is pretty much spearheaded by a woman named Judy Heumann. Okay. And Judy passed away this past year, but she was really the person who fought hard to make sure that people with disabilities had equal rights. And a lot of that also came out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay. What people with disabilities were seeing is, oh, wait a minute, everybody's getting their rights. There's women's rights, there's civil rights, and people with disabilities were like, well, where are my rights?
It seems like people with disabilities are always the last ones in line.
Yes.
With these conversations.
Yes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about probably why that is, and then I have some interesting stats that might change minds about how important it is. But, I think one of the most important things is that it was considered a major victory for people with disabilities and actually the country, because it said we as the United States prohibit discrimination of disabled people. Right. We prohibit it. And the exact language that President Richard Nixon signed into law.
Richard Nixon signed this into law?
Yep, on September 26, 1973.
So he did a couple good things.
Yeah, actually, yes. But that's another conversation.
Different podcast.
Yes.
We'll get Jolene in here to talk politics.
Yes. She could talk disability, too. But what it said is no otherwise handicapped individual in the United States shall solely be, by reasons of his handicap, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
Right.
Big deal. However, one of the caveats to that was that it was a huge victory, people celebrated, but then it wasn't enforced. So nobody was paying attention to it, even though people with disabilities were like, hey, wait a minute, we have a right to be here. No one was enforcing it. And as a matter of fact, when Jimmy Carter became president, they started talking about repealing it.
Oh, really?
And taking away rights because it was too expensive.
Right.
Too expensive to retrofit buildings, too expensive to build buildings, too expensive to put curb cuts on streets.
Right.
So what ended up happening in 1977 was the biggest protest, longest protest in the U.S., and it happened in San Francisco, and in several other cities, major cities in the country. And Seattle was one of them.
Okay.
In Denver,
Of course, Seattle was one of them.
yes, Seattle, New York, Minneapolis, Chicago.
We love the protest.
Yes.
That's what we do.
Yes. But the biggest one, of course, was in San Francisco, and they did a sit-in for 25 days in the Health and Human Services building. I can't remember the exact acronym, but what ended up happening was they got the attention of a lot of people. And I was on the news. We had some ferocious newscasters in San Francisco who were really publicizing it. And
what year was this?
This was 1977.
77.
So,
what if Ray Taliaferro was on the air back then?
I don't know.
KGO in San Francisco.
I can't remember. The name of. There's a great documentary called Crip Camp that everybody should watch because it really tells the story of what happened, of how this came into being. But they sat in there for a long time, 25 days. Some of them went on hunger strikes. Now, if you can imagine people who are quadriplegic laying on these mattresses on the floor, people needing care.
Right.
And then the government, in all its wisdom, the FBI, decided to cut off all water. They cut off all communications. And if you watch Crip Camp, you'll see this. But then the folks who were deaf got this brilliant idea. Well, we have all these interpreters here, and we know there are people who are deaf outside.
Right.
So they were communicating through the windows what they needed. And the Black Panthers stepped up and supplied them with food because they considered it a human rights issue.
Right.
So after all that, all those protests, Washington finally got wise, and it was signed into the act was actually meant to. They were going to enact it. They were actually going to do things.
Right.
So after April 28th, 1977, that's when all these things started to happen, where people were able to get access to buildings. They started doing retrofitting. They made sure education was accessible, all of those things. And it changed people's lives.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, you could go to work.
Yeah. Which gives you meaning, right? Gives you meaning and purpose in your life.
Yeah.
Because people derive a lot of meaning out of contributing to the world.
Yes.
So.
Absolutely. And why shouldn't they?
Yeah.
I mean, it still boggles my mind to think of folks who have all this capability,
right,
and they were not allowed to express it, or they couldn't find an avenue. Where if some of them did, it would be a one-off, like, this, what we call inspiration porn. This one person. Wow, aren't they magnificent?
Yeah.
But
and then they're all splashed all over the magazines and TV shows.
Yes. And that's not really what folks with disabilities want. They want equal rights. They want to be able to participate in the same way as everyone else. Yeah. And so this Section 504 changed the way people with disabilities engaged in work, school, transportation, housing, and they gained independence.
Right.
So Some we can thank for curb cuts that help us.
And I'm down by my house in the shoreline. They're putting a bunch in right now.
Yeah, buttons on the doors.
Yeah.
Guess what? We have these people to thank for those things.
Yeah. So 50 years later, where are we at now?
Well, one of the things that Section 504 really did, and the activism of these people, they kept going. They kept saying, look, no, we need more. Because Section 504 was written into an act. It wasn't an act itself.
Right.
So it was a subpart of an act. And it didn't change the way private industry worked with people with disabilities.
Okay, so this was just the public sector who had to comply to...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Anyone receiving federal funds. So what happened was, because of their activism, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, was signed into law in 1990 by President Bush, another Republican.
Oh, interesting.
So, it was really because of these people that we actually got a civil rights law. The Americans with Disabilities Act, now amended, is a civil rights law.
Right.
And it's why it's such a big deal that we follow it.
Yeah. So when you say now amended, what does that mean?
That means in 2011, they amended the act to include a lot more definitions of what a disability is. Okay. And what the criteria for a disability is. And I could go on for another half hour about all the sections.
But we want to keep this short.
Yeah. I could talk for a long time.
Oh, I know. But Valerie said we want people to listen to the whole thing, so let's keep it short.
Yeah. And there I go.
So from a practical perspective, how is this applied? Like, let's look at North Seattle College, for instance, or your typical college. How does it apply to our work in a college?
Section 504 Section 504 and the ADA mean that we have to give people accessibility if they come and say, I have a disability.
Right.
Now, how they document it, all those are still kind of being discussed because there's no law, there's nothing in the law that stipulates how we accept people with disabilities.
Right.
So it's up to individual institutions or entities to decide what their requirements are for people establishing that they have a disability.
Right.
So more broadly speaking, more finely speaking, I would say that I'm going to just give the very blanket example of someone who's blind.
Okay.
Needs to have access at the same rate as their peers, as independently as possible.
Right.
So what that means is you're teaching a course, you use Canvas. Canvas needs to be accessible by what we call a screen reader. Mm-hmm. And those screen readers are just fabulous pieces of technology that blind individuals use to be able to understand what's on the screen.
Right.
It has to be accessible.
Right. And Canvas has put in a lot of tools to help with that, right? It will tell you if your documents are not accessible. So, and give you recommendations for how to make sure that they're accessible, like putting in headers or making sure there's alt text and so forth.
And even beyond Canvas, you have to think of your emails. Yep. So I don't, because I think they're problematic, but putting the little tree frog, it has to be able to be read by a screen reader. So you have to have a description. You have to use an alt text descriptor for that.
Right.
Any email you send out, if someone is reading it with a screen reader, there's going to be, if you use images, there's going to be tons of things that they won't be able to read.
Right.
And so it's really important that we actually think about those things when we're designing what we put out.
Right.
And I know, because I teach as well, that it's super challenging and it takes a lot of energy, but I think it's worth it.
But, technology, again, is coming to the rescue for some of it. I noticed on PowerPoint recently they have an AI feature now for alt text. Mm-hmm. So if you have images in your PowerPoint, you can just have the AI write the description for you and just double check it. So that takes a little bit of labor, off your plate.
Yes. Well, and this is a side note. The other way this impacts it is There is another law called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it just got ratified or re-upped,
Right.
for lack of a better word. And it is now in version 2.2, and it basically says we need to have everything accessible by screen readers for people blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing.
Wow. And what's the consequence if you don't? What happens to the college if you're found not to be compliant?
Yes, and it has happened locally. Olympic College and
In Washington State.
Lake Washington Tech.
Lake Washington Tech.
They got dinged in the Office of Civil Rights. So when they do that, you have to enter into this agreement that you're going to fix everything.
Oh, wow.
So it's very important, and because the pandemic gave us some amazing gifts in learning how to really make things accessible, and many things are still not accessible, and the federal government knows this, and they're looking. They will do random searches. After last year, they did 100 random searches in the country of schools' websites to see if they were accessible or not.
Wow.
So it's really important that we pay attention to this stuff, because there's two big laws that say things need to be accessible.
And there's laws, right? So that's the stick, as it were,
It's a
right?
stick,
It's a
absolutely.
stick. And so, but there's other lenses to look at this too. You can look at it through a equity and justice lens as well, which is
Absolutely.
maybe more the carrot
Yes.
approach. Like you're making these changes to create a more just society.
Yeah, and welcoming, that people are accepted. They're welcome to come here. And I think on my end, for my work, that's the most important thing, is do students feel like they belong? And we all know from millions of different student engagement surveys that belonging is pretty much the most important thing to a college student.
Right.
And my job, and I believe our jobs, are to create that welcoming environment for folks. In 2018, the CDC reported 1 in 4 adults live with a disability, 61 million. And 12.8 of them reported cognitive difficulties being the highest. That was the highest. Concentrating, remembering, making decisions, all those things that we need to do when we're in college.
Yeah, and are we seeing an increase in this?
Yes.
Yeah. Are there any causal factors for that, or how is that showing up?
Well, I think in our environment, I think there are a number of things. I think the first thing is that more traditionally aged students are coming to us very well informed about the laws. So they've had IEPs, they've had 504 plans, and they know what their rights are. So this is sort of a new wave of students. And the second thing is the diagnoses have gone up, particularly around mental health. And mental health is a big factor. When we look at changing data over the last 10 years in disability services offices, mental health disabilities pretty much are taking over in the top category.
Yeah.
And it's often comorbid with ADHD, with autism, etc. But what's happening is people are coming to us as extremely intersectional, complex beings.
Yeah. And so on a local level, like I'm a faculty member here at North Seattle College, or I'm an administrator in charge of a department here at North or at a college generally. What are some practical things that I can do to address some of these issues and be in compliance with the law, and also pursue, an equity and justice approach to addressing disability?
Really good question. I think that the first thing I would always say, no matter where I'm speaking or what audience I'm talking with, is that collaboration is the most important thing. And it's really important to come around a table and talk about what do we want, what is our vision of what a student is, and how can we make sure that we're addressing that and honoring that.
Right.
By including people with disabilities in whatever way we need to. And it's not, I think in the past, it's come down to one person or one office. oh, that's disability services problem. But it's really all of ours, and we need to come together and talk about it as a whole, especially when you think 1 in 4 adults has a disability.
Yeah.
And, it's everybody's responsibility to figure out how to make this work. And in a very practical level, we all have different ideas of ways things can be accessible. And it's not just one person's purview to decide.
Yeah. So we should all be looking at our programs, our classes, and whatever we're doing through that lens, that accessibility lens.
Yeah.
And saying, is this accessible, and what can I do to make it make it more accessible for our students?
Yeah. And part of that is also this shift in how we think about disability prior to probably the 1990s, probably when the law changed or the civil rights law came into being. It was seen as a very medical problem, like you're the problem. Valerie,
Right.
You're the problem because you have lost a leg.
Right.
Now it's the environment's problem. Like, what are we doing in the environment that we need to change so that people feel welcome? Much the same as we do for almost all of our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts.
Right.
It's really what kind of environment do we want folks to come into? Do we want students to be successful? Then we need to do certain things within that environment.
Right.
I do think it's hard to wrap our brains around because we exist in systems that don't necessarily support that thinking.
Yeah, for sure. And if you don't have the disability, you're not going to see the barriers as readily, right? And that's why I think sometimes when you're looking at the campus, having somebody who has a disability on the committee,
Sure.
bringing that lens to you might want to look about how you're building this structure over here. Is it accessible so somebody like me can get there, So.
Right. And I do think that because of the laws, many folks do have that when they're building things.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
As you know from all your library experience so far.
Yeah, but you still have to double check, right? You never can be totally 100% certain. Has this person thought about the ADA laws and so forth, and so always double checking, making sure,
absolutely,
and triple checking.
Yeah, and it's also a thing where you really want to listen to people's lived experiences, and understand where they're coming from. I think a lot of people with disabilities, in particular younger folks, they're coming from high school environments that maybe weren't that produced a fair amount of stigma. And so either they don't tell you they have a disability, or they are super defensive about their disability, or they feel ashamed. And I think it's really important that this is such a normal part of existence, not only for human beings, but even all animals.
Right.
And it's really important that this is normal.
Right.
There's nothing different about someone having a disability. Nothing. And as a matter of fact, all of us are going to have a disability at some point.
Yeah.
And
thank you, age.
Yeah.
Thank you, age, time.
Time, or,
You're a menace to society.
Yeah. Dang it. Can we just stop it? But also, we could walk out on the street and get hit by something and be disabled. And I think it's so important that we remember that fragility.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to have compassion.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to go into names. We had an employee here who was riding a bike down the street on College Way and hit a pothole. His bike flipped, and he was wearing his helmet, but he still landed on his head and permanent damage.
Yeah.
Right? And like that in seconds.
Super important to remember that. And I think that is always, on my days when I get frustrated, because I do in my job, I remember that fragility, and I think, okay, it's really important that we listen to the stories. It doesn't mean that we bend over backwards and do everything under the sun, but it's really important that we honor what people are coming to the table with, and meet them where they are and figure out what works and what doesn't work.
And how do you, I'm coming at this this next question from a faculty member point of view, or even maybe a staff member point of view, and you observe that somebody has a disability, and how do you approach them about it, especially if you're seeing that they need support, right? How do you recommend broaching that conversation?
Yeah, very difficult because, it's disability is all about self-disclosure.
Yeah.
You can't out anyone without them outing themselves
Exactly.
to you. And so what's really important...
And there's FERPA regulations around that too.
Yes, there are. Yeah. It's not written into the law about the ADA or about disability disclosure, but I certainly would not... I wouldn't recommend asking anyone what their disability is.
Right, yeah.
But because it can be misconstrued as discrimination.
Yeah.
Like, how are you using that information is really much more like the concern, I think, of people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I always let instructors or staff members know, hey, what resources are you connected to on campus? I'd love to connect you with lots of different resources, and here's a bunch. And I think that's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. And I brought up FERPA because I know in the past, I know you've gotten questions like, oh, can I reach out to so-and-so about this person and their disability? And you've said, no, that's a FERPA violation. Yeah. So don't share people's disability status.
Right. No.
Yeah.
Never do it. It's not as stringent as HIPAA. We do not go by HIPAA in our office, but it is, I would say, pretty stringent.
Okay. Yeah. Just want to make sure we got that point across. So we're going to start wrapping up here. On a personal level, we've been scaling down from the 5,000 foot view with the actual laws and scaling down more locally. So now we'll get down to the personal. On a personal level, what should people be doing in their day-to-day lives to advocate for people with disabilities and in their own lives, and maybe if they're a person with a disability too?
Yeah. I actually feel a little emotional talking about this, but I think it's there are broader things you can do, like just being curious and going online and typing in, like college students with disabilities, or Nothing About Us Without Us, which is a movement that started in South Africa.
Oh, interesting.
By people with disabilities. Don't make any laws, don't do anything without our voice being present. And there was actually, I don't remember the act, but it was the House of Representatives here in Washington signed a law into place about that as well. So being curious is the most important thing, and to approach that from, especially where we are in knowledge-based business, being curious about what the disability movement is all about.
Right.
And watching Crip Camp, or exploring what different things you can do in your life to make people feel welcome.
Yeah.
And, I can speak as a person, and I will out myself as a person with disability. Some of the things that were so valuable to me growing up, well, not really growing up because, but when I was in college, were just people listening to me and telling me it was okay, and really letting me know that I was smart.
Right.
And I think that's really important because, especially at the college level, there you have a lot of folks walking around who do not think they're smart, and they really are. They really are, and
sometimes they just need to hear that
they
support.
do. You can do this. One of the things I say to some of my students in a very practical way, and I didn't even get this through education, I got this on my own personal life, was like, just practice being 1% better at something, 1% better at writing something down, 1% better at following through with one thing.
Right.
And it kind of takes some of that weight off.
Those incremental changes.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to happen overnight, right?
Yeah. I also, in personal lives, but I really do think that it's important that we look at inclusion as something that's very connected to diversity and equity. It is diversity and equity. There are lots of numbers out there that break down disability by race and ethnicity, and disability doesn't care whether or not you identify as male, female, transgender, binary, whatever. It doesn't care. It doesn't care what ethnicity you are. It doesn't care what race you are.
Right.
And as long as we know that, we can approach each other with compassion and understanding.
And so for your office, this will be my last question. So how can people contact your office? What services can you provide students, and how can you support faculty when they're working with a student who has a disability?
So one of the things I did when I got on board here a year and a half ago was really try to improve the website. It was pretty good already, but it just needed to be more accessible in being able to read it. Like, it had a lot of words on it. And so I wanted to move to tiles where you click and it's just much more apparent. I really think that's a great place to start to see what we do.
Right.
I did create a faculty section.
Oh, nice.
And included in there some tips on how to work with sign language interpreters, not only in person but also on Zoom.
Okay.
And then students connect directly with me by filling out a form, and it's their application for accommodation, and then they meet with me and we go through an access planning meeting where we engage in something called the interactive process.
The interactive process, what does that look like?
That's where I listen to lived experience, and we talk about how their disability impacts them in the academic setting.
Okay.
It's where I ask them lots of very direct questions. What happens when you take an exam? What happens when you try to take notes? What happens when you try to read?
Yeah.
I'm usually pulling at them.
Yeah. Sounds like a kind of a qualitative investigation.
It really is. It is. What is that? Motivational interviewing. It's just like that.
Motivational interview. Okay.
Yeah. And then at that meeting, we arrive at a reasonable conclusion of what the accommodations should be. And then I send them follow-ups, and then their letters of accommodations are sent. I think for faculty, I think it's really important to remember that I'm here as a resource. I say disability services is three-pronged priorities: the institution, the students, and faculty.
Yeah.
So my job is to figure out what's going on, what do you need help with, how can we come to a good resolution. It sometimes doesn't end up beautiful.
Yeah.
That's the nature of human beings. But my goal in how I operate is to be as collaborative and informative as possible.
Right.
I think that's really important, because I can't do my job unless we're in on this together.
Right.
So I always encourage folks to come by and talk to me when I'm not super busy. Like, the first 2 months of the quarter are really bad for me right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this interview, because I know it is people are super swamped with student services right now, especially your office. So
I really wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And I think this is great.
Well, this has been great, and I definitely want to encourage people to reach out to Valerie. She doesn't bite.
Nope, I don't.
She's very friendly, so don't be afraid to reach out to her, whether you are a faculty member or a student. And
staff too.
Or staff too, yeah. So, Valerie, thanks for doing this podcast, and we'll do another one maybe winter quarter with a different topic.
Absolutely, totally down for that.
Awesome.